Indian knowledge systems has this complete compact. The theory, the ways to establish the theory, the values embedded into that, and the ritual praxis, which will give you access to all of this. And this compact is essential for the entire world. There has been a one word unwritten constitution in Bharat for over 5,000 years. That word is dharma. It's the compact that builds human relationships with nature. There is no difference for us between Niti and Dharma, and it's so beautifully explained in Shastras. Right?
Right.
Niti is the Vyavaharika level, which actually is the application layer of Dharma. They are one and together. They can never be separate. There is no Adhyatma there and Niti here. It's not that. It's
Right.
nested. For us, Indian knowledge systems as a paradigm is the best way to develop complexity thinking and systems thinkers. Systems thinkers in a relational way, not just abstract systems, like you said. The problem in public policy education in India today, that you're developing a lot of one-dimensional intelligences and deploying them on multi-dimensional challenges. So fundamentally, without rejecting all the disciplines that make up public policy today, from economics to political science to public administration to public finance to technology and policy, while we have all of that, we also on top of that have a layer that improves the personal capacity. So what Nitividhana does is it gives our cohorts a way to actually, truly, authentically expand self-agency.
Namaste, welcome to Bodh, a series of episodes where we discuss dharmic views on a range of topics. And today we speak public policy. So, public policy today speaks different languages, mostly of efficiency, of metrics, of global best practices. But when we speak of Bharat, we do not have a blank slate. It is a civilization. And what happens when policy is disconnected from culture? We'll know today. And we are very, very honored to be joined by Raghava Krishna ji, the founder and CEO of Brhat. With over 24 years of experience spanning game development, learning design, and entrepreneurship, Raghavji brings a unique interdisciplinary lens to the table. Sir has led cross functional creative product development teams, built transformative learning ecosystems, and shaped the conversations around organizational and national culture. So, through Bṛhat, Raghivji continues to reimagine public policy by grounding it in civilizational wisdom and a deep understanding of Bharat's cultural context. Welcome, Raghivji. Welcome to both.
Thank you, Cherish. This feels home for some reason.
Of course, it does, sir. So, without further ado, sir, I want to directly dive into a question that's been pressing in the public policy circles. That despite capable institutions, we have sincere reform efforts. Why do policy outcomes in India they continue to struggle to align with social behavior and lived realities of people? Why does this happen?
Yeah, I think we're making a few claims in that question, right? One, that we have capable institutions, one, that there has been reform, and one, that the social and cultural being of our civilization is not consonant, is not congruent with the institutional culture. And we'll examine each of this. I think the subject is vast, and like any good public policy thinking, we should develop the ability to ask the right questions and explore and be open to answers as they evolve, rather than express certitude that on an issue of such complexity, we state that with certitude that this is the reason why Indian society and Indian culture and Indian institutions are not congruent. Right? But we can ask intelligent questions. We can examine, and in the spirit of inquiry, we can ensure that there is better discourse around it collectively. So, firstly, let's look at institutions itself. And since we are talking about public policy, it's important to be specific and precise. And there's a lot of theory around institutions, right? And it's important to disambiguate what we mean by institutions in a particular context. Most public policy literature around this, and particularly from the works of Douglas North and others, we get a certain idea of institutions in the way we use that word in public policy context itself, right? For example, Douglas North tells us that he disambiguates between politics and policy. In politics, the idea is always expansive. Vaidyanathan Ayerji also talks about this, which is a very, very important book, Public Policy Making in India, which I think
Right.
is a must-read book for all the enthusiasts. And he talks about the difference between politics and policy, right? And sometimes there is a tendency for us to imagine that the political institutions that we have are also policy institutions, and that's where I think it's a good place to begin. Politics, by definition, has to be expansive. We all understand this, right? Because it's democracy. It's defined by the logic of the importance of what is called the marginal vote, and the amount of money that chases marginal vote in India is phenomenal. And Dr. Jayaprakash Narayan and others have done this analysis and showed us why, at the root of whatever crisis we experience and imagine, there is this systemic issue, right? So politics, by definition, in a multi-party, highly competitive, fairly diverse society like Bharat, in fact, extremely diverse society like Bharat, is going to be very, very difficult, and a pursuit of making sure that you co-opt all kinds of margins. So that is where you have a systemic issue where the policy intent or the policy goal, which is about ensuring that there are crystal clear goals, there are outcomes in the way we imagine that, there are measurement metrics, all the things that you would associate with what is considered to be a good policy, uh, is sometimes at loggerheads with the political design itself. So that's rule number one that we need to understand. And Douglas North gives us a good way to think about this, about institutions. He says institutions set the rules, and they set the rules and behaviors through incentives. And this is the standard language that we deploy in understanding public policy. So one way of asking this question is, where is the incentive misalignment? And whenever we think about complex systems change and complex change in general, there are five elements that need to come together. And it's a good way, like I said, rather than posit a definitive answer, we can actually imagine what would be a good analysis. So the five elements would be the firstly the vision itself. Like what is the vision that we have? And I think that's where our talk around culture, civilization would actually be critical. What do we imagine ourselves as? Coherence is basically when there is a congruity between the story that you're telling yourself, whether you're a person or a nation, the story that you're telling yourself and the form that you give to that story. As long as they are working together, then you will have coherence, right? For example, it's manifest destiny, which means that for us having an expansive outlook and whatever foreign policy that they execute is coming from a doctrine, and the doctrine is congruent with the kind of behaviors that you see. For outsiders, it might look hypocritical, but from their perspective, it is national interest to expand their influence across the world, right? Because they consider it as manifest destiny. So, what is Bharat's, what we call the grand civilizational narrative? What is the grand narrative of Bharat? So that's one way to look at this. Second is skills, and public policy particularly is fairly in its current form, and the way we practice, and we've also sort of transplanted a different experience onto ourselves, and that goes into the history of knowledge production itself, and we should examine this question going into the knowledge part later. But there are certain skills required and competencies required to frame good policies in the way we've conceptualized this vision, the policy vision, right? So we can ask, is it because we don't have the skills and competencies? Are we not able to do this because we haven't sufficiently educated ourselves in how policy drafting has to be done, how policy communication has to be done, how policy consensus has to be arrived at? How do you actually build the rules of the game in a way that incentives are aligned? So that's one. The third is incentives itself. Like, are we creating the right incentives amongst a wide set of stakeholders for policy and institutional culture to be congruent to national interest or national mission? That's one. Then there is resources. Now, do you have enough resources? And we should, like, we all ask this question today, but we should also be cognizant that this question has become affordable only now in the last, let's say, 25 years.
Right.
And if you take a longer arc of history, depending on where you want to place your starting point, if you want to go back millennia, then this question has a different answer and a completely different Why? Right? Because then we actually see that when India was at its highest, there was a congruence between culture and state and policy. So that's a truth, and we don't need to shy away from that. But if you put your lens in the last few hundred years, it's only in the last 25 years that you and I can actually ask this question. So while this question seems urgent, and I understand the animated discourse around it, particularly for the younger generation, for your generation, and all of us owe this answer to you. But it's also important for the younger generation to imagine or to understand that there is a certain moment in time and circumstance that has allowed for this question to become relevant, right? In public policy itself, for an issue to become a public policy issue, it takes about 2 to 3 decades, because
Yes.
otherwise there are many problems. How does it become a public policy issue that actually the state has to take note of and for a policy to be drafted around it? Similarly, this question of institutional culture is now being examined because some of the extant ideas, we now have experience of the institutions and the institutional culture that we had between 1947 to 1991 and from 1991 to now. So we have something to look back in a substantial way and compare. So
Right.
the question of resources is an important one. Whether it is intellectual resources, whether it is energy resources, whether it is financial resources, whether it is network resources, have we accrued enough resources to actually look at this? So that's another way to look at this question. The last one is action plan. Right? You might have the vision, you might have the skills, you might have the resources, you might have the incentives aligned. But if you do not know what is to be done, and if you do not have the execution rigor of what needs to be done, let's say in public policy context in the next 6 months, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, maybe that's the horizon that we can think about. That's very critical. And here I think we are seeing an emergent paradigm, which is also important in the context of the question that you asked about the difference and the chasm between institutions and policy outcomes.
Right.
Uh, this is called what Sanjeev Sanyal ji, Krishna Brahmanyam ji, and others have been articulating as the focus on process reform. A lot of reform that has happened in India has been either Big Bang or changing the names in the name of reform. Right? It's the same
Right.
policy that is given a new lipstick. But in the last 5 to 10 years, we see a very important and I think a very intelligent approach of actually tinkering with the small plumbing that needs to go, that goes into policy making. So here, the policy meets the administrative structures. It meets the actual user experience, to use a product language, of how people receive this policy in real life experience. Right? How does the website work? How does the rules get engaged? How does tenders get floated? All of policy outcomes begin with this kind of experiential elements, if you think about it that way. So I think the ability to think about policy reform and institutional culture in process steps is also important. So if you
Right.
sum it all up, then there are some macro patterns that emerge. One, we should take stock of where we are when we talk about this question of institutional chasm and institutional this one, about what is the ontology and what is the history and knowledge system that this idea of institution comes to us from, and
Right.
does it represent our cultural interest? That's a very, very important question at the vision level. Assuming that you have taken these definitions of institutions, assuming that you have borrowed these ideas that have come to us, let's say from a liberal democracy march, assuming that, do they fit into the extant culture of your land? And do you have a plan, and do you have the skills and resources to then execute that? Right? So this question would be mute if you were to say that the current paradigm works for us. If the current paradigm works for us, then you and I should not be talking about a culture compatible public policy, because it is
Right.
working. Right? If there is enough proof, this question, we are able to ask this question, and we are asking for reflection, an honest reflection on this question, because there is established literature and experiential wisdom that somehow the kind of outcomes that we want through our institutions have not happened. And therefore, this question of whether institutions, the way we are currently defining that, are culture compatible or not, becomes urgent and becomes necessary. This is also the epistemological stance that we are taking at Bṛhat, right? That there is obviously a scientificity to it. There is obviously a certain kind of managerial approach to it. There is also metricization. All of that is great. But if public choice is just governed by that, you and I don't have a problem. But in Bharat, as a living civilization, public choice and the mental models and the worldview that we have is actually derived also from other set of institutions that we still see consistently. Right? And
Right.
this is a uniquely Indian experience that we must understand, because wherever else colonization was experienced in, for most part, the institutional architecture and the culture were completely changed. But in Bharat, thanks to our ancestors, thanks to the resurgence of our traditions, our institutions in the traditional sense continue to live. That's why we call ourselves a living civilization. Right?
Right.
The institutions created for governance are not exactly mirroring that because the context has also changed in a post-industrial society. So it's a unique Indian problem, and therefore it will also have a unique Indian solution, which is why increasingly you will see leaders like Jaishankar ji, Modi ji, and everyone articulating that whether you look at Panchpran, whether you look at Mission Life, all of these things are now looking at articulating public policy vision in a language and culture and meaning making process that we understand. So this is an Indian experience that we should examine.
Right. I'm so glad that we are speaking about culture compatible policy right now. And I'm so glad that we started here, where we identify the problem correctly and honestly. So, Raghavji, what I have for you now is from is a question that we encounter a lot of times when we speak of culture compatible policy in larger masses, that why do you want to why are you so attached, or why are you so nostalgic about what India has to offer, or things from the shastras, or why do you want to take extra effort of going back, understanding, and then bringing it back, or rather how they call it, force fit earlier solution into modern problems. There are current frameworks, there are well developed frameworks from the West, which can still be taken and tweaked a little bit according to the psyche of Indian public and be used. Why do we want to go back? Why do we want to understand things from the ancient past of India and be so grateful to the ancestors at all?
Good. I mean, I think in our minds we've got this issue. It's also a systemic issue. It's not. It's not a moral issue to be framed as people are not understanding the morality of this, or the fact that somebody arguing for this is necessarily looking at it from a higher morality. I think morality is a downstream consequence of how knowledge production happens, and particularly in public policy and state design. Anything ancient is not necessarily archaic.
Mhm.
And I think there is a conflation of anything ancient as archaic and antiquated in the Indian mind. Right?
Right.
And that is particularly driven by education because we've also been disconnected from our languages. We've been disconnected from our sources. And this question, Cherish, if we have to honestly, and particularly for our younger friends, if we have to answer this question, there is a bit of intellectual exploration that we need to do to understand the way knowledge is produced in a society, which means that you will have to examine both knowledge production and how human learning happens
Right.
and how learning is then transmitted. Since we spoke about institutions, institutions essentially are ways of knowing what is important, conducting the right kind of behaviors, guiding the right kind of behaviors towards what is important, and having the means to transmit that understanding intergenerationally. Right? Now, once you take this definition, you start looking at not just economic and political institutions, you look at cultural institutions, you look at traditional institutions. Right? Suddenly, you can do an entire master's course in public policy in India and never hear about something called a sampradaya, which still
Totally.
guides millions of people in Bharat on how they conduct their life, and that has a continuous lineage of at least 2000 years, 1200 years, and we speak so casually about such vast amounts of space and time, right? But there is continuity in that. We've never examined what are the institutional frameworks that allow for those traditions to continue. There has not been an honest attempt by practitioners of public policy to understand how Bharat and Bharatiyas make their decisions, right?
Mhm.
So we'll examine this question from that perspective on how humans learn. Let's sort of abstract it to that, and then what are the ways in which the learning can be transmitted, so that when a policy intent is established, it resonates with the way people normally and organically are in a region, right? And why we are talking about the not just the necessity of our knowledge systems in Indian policy making. In fact, we are making a grander claim, but responsibly, that Indian knowledge systems need to have a seat at the global epistemic table. It's not just Bharat; it's actually for the global futures that we need, and we've articulated this that for an integral global world, as even with the complexity of globalization and deglobalization that we are hearing today, You will need a new kind of worldview to be supplied that comes from a different experience of life. What does this mean? Humans learn in three ways. Right? The first way of learning, which is true for you, for me, for everyone in the world, is the first person subjective experience.
Right.
All of your life's most profound moments, think about it, right? Whether it is love, parenthood, experience with the death of a loved one, whatever your real, whatever makes you human, are all first person subjective experience.
Hmm.
Now, can it be replicated in the same measure in some other person? Can it be generalized? Can it be spoken about in metrics? It cannot be,
It
right?
cannot.
It is a first person subjective experience, which is unique to us, but it is learning. In fact, if you look at your behavior, my behavior, it is not changing because we've heard some theory. It is changing because in our experience, there would be a moment where we realize, okay, that lesson applies to me in an experiential way now, right? If you are able to summon that understanding, then the theory transforms into behavior.
Yes.
And that is what all public policy is also about, behavioral transformation, right? So there is a vast dimension of human learning which currently cannot be included in the way policies or knowledge production that informs policies is being framed. So that's one problem. And this is, I'm not making this up, this is from a very, very important book called Unified Theory of Knowledge by a person called Greg Conricus. I would recommend all listeners also to sort of look that up, because unless you examine the history of and the structure of knowledge production, the present is not crystallized. The second way of knowing, second way of learning how humans learn across time and space is by telling each other stories. We are sharing this conversation. Even as I speak, there would be things that you agree with. There would be things that you might pretend that you're agreeing with, but might not agree with, right? And together, through that experience, we are constructing the meaning of what this conversation means to us.
Right.
And there will be a story about this conversation in our head. This is what has happened across history all the time. In an anthropological sense, what we get from sapiens, that Homo sapiens survived because we were able to tell each other stories, and through those stories and symbols, we were able to collaborate and outcompete the others. That's
Right.
from a Hindu worldview, there are some challenges in the way that is presented, but largely the aspect of how human societies come together and cohere through stories is there. Now, how much of storytelling, not as a layer on top of what is decided, but as a fundamental ways of making meaning itself, and making sure that the policy is fitted into, or policy is serving the story that people are telling about themselves, so that it's actually organic. It doesn't have to require radical behavioral transformation. So the
Hmm.
friends who are asking us this question, like you said, about why can't we just take what is working in the world, the reason is not about any nostalgia. The reason is not because we are we are just animated about our past. It's not zingoism. It's actually a case for efficacy. It's a language that everybody should be able to understand, that things that are organic to human behavior will actually have a deeper impact.
Right.
And this is not something that's coming to us only from India now. Across the world now, if you look at politics and policy, both, you will see this trend, and we'll get into that. The third way of learning is objective examination, right?
Hmm.
Where the subject and object are separate, and you examine the phenomena, whatever lens that you, scientific, this one. And then you can generalize, you can replicate, you can universalize certain principles, and then you can supplant that in different places. The Western history, because of the fight between religion and science, has actually privileged this third way of knowing in what we call enlightenment. And enlightenment is the birth of whatever we consider as modern public policy and political economy as we know it now, because it's liberal democracy. It's based on a certain idea of self. And the idea of self emerged as a response and a reaction and a revolution against an imposed faith. So the Western history has a unique cultural context, that the faith there has some kind of demand from humans. And if you go back to what they themselves call as dark ages, of course there has been great literature even those 600 years, but if you look at that time period, they call themselves in dark ages when they were having those fights. Fundamentally, the Enlightenment period came as a rebellion against what was imposed as faith, right? And
True.
therefore reason became, and you have these chasms. You have a chasm between God and scientist. You have a chasm between faith and reason. You have a chasm between what is considered to be moral and what is considered to be legal.
Mm-hmm.
All of these problems emerge because the metaphysics of enlightenment is basically that we are capable of pure reason, and therefore we deserve infinite freedom, and law should be about securing the infinite freedoms of individuals, and therefore the role of the state is to guard those freedoms and give only those things that are give to the state only those things that are absolutely necessary. Broadly, whatever we call as social contract or whatever you call as the liberal compact comes from that experience. But that is not our experience.
Mm-hmm.
We did not have this challenge because our knowledge system includes all three ways of knowing.
Right.
When you look at something like Aham Brahmasmi, we use this in all spiritual contexts. But if you look at it in a learning context, which is the source of all spiritual learning as well, you will see that there is no distinction for us between science and faith, between God and reason. In fact, in the Indian knowledge systems, it's a moment of wonder. And you spoke about why there is disenchantment in the young people. I also feel that it's because we haven't given them enough opportunity to experience wonder of our own culture, of our own knowledge systems. Now, imagine a knowledge system which has a darshana like Nyaya, which is a logical, it is entirely a logical structure, right? And logical structure called Nyaya comes under the Astika darshanas in our knowledge traditions. And
Yes.
Astika traditions are those that accept Vedas pramana, but also have an affiliation and an acceptance of Ishvara. So there's a logical system that is able to explain to you how this happens. For
Mm-hmm.
example, one of the Vedangas, Vyakarana. Through Vyakarana, you can get to moksha, right? Imagine, because in the Western mind, grammar and liberation might not have any link, but for us, it was yoga, which has which is a little ambiguous on the question of God in that sense, still has everything that you need to get to moksha, right? So
Right.
these are knowledge systems that have evolved, and this is a simple intellectual moral case that we have, that we've just lived together for a longer period of time, and therefore we've had, like any adult civilization, we've had the opportunity to examine the vicissitudes of man and nature and man's nature in a lot of different ways. Fortunately for us, because of the absolute emphasis on knowledge and truth in this culture, we've also codified that as very, very sophisticated systems of inquiry that take not just the scientific approach, but also the experiential approach, also the lived folk approach. So when we say Indian knowledge systems, we are looking at the Shastras, we are looking at the folk traditions, we are looking at the tribal traditions. Ayurveda did not come from somebody imagining it. Ayurveda came from somebody living in the forest who was actually experimenting with those, flora and fauna, right? And then it
Yes.
got codified. So this confluence, this constant dialogue between all streams of Bharata, which actually has produced this system, is our inheritance. It is
Mm-hmm.
actually unintellectual to disown this intellectual inheritance. So the question should be flipped. Rather than ask, why are we doing this? You should be asking, we should actually be examining this question. One, at a one level, how can it be possible for a civilization that has lived together to not have produced knowledge? It's not
Correct.
like our civilization began with enlightenment. Therefore, what is it? It's a normal intellectual inquiry. Secondly, which I think is a learner and learning concern for me, and something that we should empathize with and start working on, is how can we recreate this wonder? And like we keep saying at Bṛhat, our pedagogy is generate that moment of wonder, because that leads to gratitude, and only gratitude can actually secure curiosity. When you
Right.
feel grateful about what you've inherited, you become curious to know how they've done it. And when you're curious and when you experience gratitude, you have contentment and you have belonging. Once you belong, then the examination becomes a lot more productive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is how I look at it. This is how we've been articulating it at Bṛhat. That the logical case for this is that it's a continuous civilization. It has a vaster repertoire of learning. It is a learning case. It's not a case for supremacy. It's not a case for anything else. The fact is that we've actually solved this question of what is worth learning and how to learn it best and how to transfer it best. Civilizations are basically Anything that answers these three questions: what is worth learning, what is the way to learn it the best, and how do you transmit it? If you start looking at this from a knowledge production perspective, I think all of us would engage with this more productively rather than ask superficial questions.
Totally, Raghavji, very, very well said. In fact, we have a lot of such conversations at Brhat internally, and that, in fact, shapes a lot of our worldview. And I couldn't agree more with you when you mentioned about why youngsters have a certain amount of doubt in the current, when we want to speak of IKS or anything around it.
And we
It's
should
because
respect it and engage with it productively, not dismiss it.
totally. And in experience, when we are able to probably articulate well and give it to the current generation in proper format, there is a next level of conviction that this generation brings when we are able to put it properly.
Absolutely, and I'm a big believer in this generation. I'm a huge believer that if we are able to solve for this gap that we have in how we experience ourselves and the stories that are told about us,
Hmm.
there hasn't been a generation with so much of creative resource and so much of entrepreneurial ability as this generation, which can then really do the amplification. My generation did not do it. We've actually created, in fact, and I keep joking even in our internal circles, that what we do is penance in a lot of ways, right? Because we didn't have the means to actually know it ourselves. So
Hmm.
our entire effort at Bṛhat is to make sure that when somebody young is going out, they should not make the same mistakes or have a protracted journey out into the world and then realize that they've been sold the wrong story. They should at least make new mistakes, right? They should be given access to this knowledge. They should be given this kind of argumentation, and then of course using their own intelligence it will flourish and they will decide for themselves. But once they decide, I think the ability of this generation to tell the story well is phenomenal.
Absolutely. In fact, I would like to bring forth a small little example that I have had, an experience that we've had around people with, I mean, a lot of youngsters. So when you speak of wonder, when I happen to mention, like I'm brought up in the south of India, and when I
Hmm.
happen to mention about the science behind, in fact, just the idea behind why we have Rangoli, or why it is put with rice flour, and the floor is wiped clean, and then you make very nice geometric patterns, and two times in a day. The vision behind it is also feeling for the larger ecosystem, feeding them and making it a part of your routine. And when such a perspective was put forth, it was received with a lot of excitement, a lot of appreciation, and then the willingness to deep dive into, or rather the attitude of tell me more, what else do you have to offer, or what else our civilization has to offer. So totally, if we are able to put it well, if articulate it well, there is a lot of scope of the
We need a
interest.
generation of interlocutors who can take this knowledge and communicate it, and you guys should do it.
Right, sir. And like you mentioned, generally, that it should not happen as an accident.
Hmm.
So a few people are getting access to such knowledge. A few people are inclined to it naturally, and it shouldn't be like that. The structure should be such that everybody is given that opportunity to explore our rich heritage. So, coming back to our conversation today, why are we speaking of culture compatible policy? And in that, education, like you mentioned, is a huge, huge chunk. How do you view this whole process? How do you think that we will be able to take this whole knowledge in a structured format, that it is at least accessible to every youngster out here? And then it's their choice, of course, to take it how much they want, and engage with it how much they want. How do you see this happening really?
Yeah, I think everybody in public policy understands. We all speak very fondly about the Federalist Papers, right? When the Constitution in US was being framed and how it was communicated to public. Those are institutions. That is what institution means. Institutions means that it is able to relay and guide public choice towards national outcomes and what is good for sovereignty. Now, Indian knowledge systems has to be seen that way, that it is a public good, and state has a responsibility to promote it as a public good because it is culturally rooted. It brings the state and society together, and it also gives us access to our own vocabulary and representation in public policy. It makes it inclusive. It makes it more diverse in terms of knowledge traditions that are getting represented. So the moral and intellectual case for that, and making sure that it is part of education, because education is the force multiplier in all of this, I think is very clear. The challenge is in how do you integrate it, because knowledge has also evolved into some structures. Now we stopped at enlightenment, but to answer this question, we need to trace what happened since enlightenment in the way knowledge is produced as well, right? And and it's also interesting, you said that some people have access, most people don't. In fact, people who don't go into a formal education in India have access to this knowledge. It is the imposition of a certain kind of value system in education that has alienated most of us from this, which is
Right.
what we are trying to correct. Right? A lot of people who don't have the English education actually think in these terms. I'll give you an example. And Kapil Tiwari ji is a famous ecologist and anthropologist from Andhra Pradesh. He says in one of his speeches that when he went into the field study, and he was trying to work with the tribe, and they have their own rituals around the mountain, the lake, and everything, which actually is protecting their commons. We understand this when it's presented as governance of commons, right? In public policy, as opposed to state, there is a whole theory, Ostrom's theory of governance of commons. We understand this, but it is lived in Bharat. And when he was talking to somebody there, and he said, "How do you protect the mountain?" He says the person did not understand that question, and this is something to actually reflect. He said, I was not able to relay this question because to him, to the person there in that society, that question was like, how do you take care of yourself? They were not seeing themselves as separate from the mountain.
Right.
So this question of how do you take care of that mountain is a question that is already loaded with a separation, and which gives you certain role. There's another project in Jabua that we had done a case study earlier, where they've actually secured rivers and forests and water supply, the Shiv Ganga project, by actually tapping into, and this is public policy, by tapping into a practice that the villagers not naturally had for thousands of years. The practice is called Halma. Halma is a sacred oath that they
Okay.
take. And if you see any community project, for example, if there is a river that is drying up, or a forest that needs to be saved, or something that needs to be built, Mahesh Sharma ji, who leads this project along with the chiefs of the tribals there, they come together once a year and they take what is called a halma. It's like a
Mhm.
collective oath, it's a sacred oath. They've revived about two districts full of forest land. They've revived rivers. They've revived water supply. And they've revived soil quality. Because the entire community comes together and they have a sacred compact. Once you take Halma, there is also community pressure on you to have pro social behavior. All of sustainability today, you see seeing so much of investment in SDG, all the vocabulary we speak, and quite frankly, all of that has not led to any improvement in the actual outcomes of SDG. Even the literature from SDG tells us that we've actually regressed, not progressed, right? But the literature also tells you that one of the biggest challenges in sustainable kind of thinking today is how do you generate pro-social behaviors in humans? It's a deep cultural question.
Right.
Pro-social means I should be able to delay or even sacrifice my gratification in the hope that I will get something larger in return. So in our initial compact, when we spoke about institutions, I said incentives. Now,
Right.
whether your culture optimizes for short-term incentives, or does your culture have the power of metaphysics to actually give infinite games to your public? It is by playing infinite games that you can have something of value created. You cannot do this by playing a finite game where all of us are using game theory, which is what is taught in public policy today. You're always focused on optimizing by strategizing what the other person is going to do, and therefore this is what is taught.
Right.
We are not taught how to collaborate in service of a larger goal, which can be sacred to both you and I, right? So this is the difference. This is what education means in our context. Now, how do we do this? We do this by making Indian knowledge systems legible, responsibly, intellectually, in a sober way without being too jingoistic about it, but in a systemic way. Most importantly, the tough, unglamorous act of building credit courses, of building pedagogies, of building assessments, of building frameworks, of deploying that, like how we're doing with certain universities right now, learning from that experience, improvising your pedagogy, creating human assets who can relay this, being humble about it, and also at a philosophical level, it's what Nagraj Pathology calls, and I absolutely love it. He says what we need is a hermeneutics of common sense, where these disciplines talk to each other. Now, the education since enlightenment has evolved into a certain university structure, which has a separation between sciences, arts, what we call humanities, and social sciences, right?
Right.
Now, that what you call as Indian knowledge systems is a vast integral way. It's a consciousness along with content and pedagogy. Now, how does
Right.
this integral knowledge system fit into a disciplinary compartmentalized structure? So, the first question that I'll ask is, what is the textbook? What is
Mm.
the assessment? How do you
Right.
rate it? What is the credit system? This is the language that's there in there. So we have to be responsible about it. We have to be sober about it, and we have to see how does history interact with itihasa. What is the commonsensical dialogue that we can have? Because itihasa for us is sociology. It is a certain kind of geographical intelligence. It is also a bit of anthropology. It is also obviously some accounts of history, but it's coming from a certain philosophy. Now, is it possible for this to be integrated or not is a question that we should examine in a sober way. And a lot of this work is happening. Very, very great scholars are having this conversation right now. And there's also a wide network in the last few years, thanks to the policy and thanks to a favorable environment. We are now able to examine these questions on our own terms. Yes, it will be ugly for some time. Yes, it will not be sophisticated. Yes, it will not have the erudition sometimes of what you see in other disciplines. But I feel that sometimes we are just so harsh on ourselves. Like I said, it depends on where you locate yourself. Are you part of that solution? Therefore, you can empathize with your own people, or are you examining your own society like an outsider looking in, right? Which and a mediator between the West and your own tradition. There is no enlightened neutrality in this. You are part of this culture, right? It doesn't matter what stance you take politically. You're still part of this larger culture called Bharat, right? So when you talk about knowledge, there is this way and this whole complex process of either integrating the disciplines that we have today with a knowledge system that we have so that they can be a dialogue, or running certain experimentations using Indian knowledge systems and then examining the outcomes of that logically. What kind of human and thought material is that producing? If we run it, if it give it fair amount of resources and fair amount of run and fair amount of leadership, right? Both these experiments need to happen simultaneously. There has to be a constant dialogue between disciplines. Our knowledge system is not antagonistic to receiving anything that is valuable from anywhere in the world. That's been our culture right from Vedic times. But at the same time, we also understand that there is a certain worldview that guides the modern disciplines and university structures, which are not compatible with this kind of organicity and integrality. So there has to be some correction there as well. Now, this complex process has to be examined very, very clearly. You
Mhm.
cannot do this either as a nationalistic project or as something that is disinterested or dispassionate. You need to find that very small sliver of balance where we understand the importance of this, but we also have intensity, which is a kind of detached attachment, right? You do it in a knowledge centric way, right?
Yes.
And that stance, and therefore the researchers and people who are engaged in this doing that is very, very important. So you need to build human capacity, you need to build learning capacity, you need to build courses, assets, textbooks, curriculum. That is the work for the next decade. That's what we need to do. If you do that, and if then you offer value, and people, if they feel smart and more equipped to deal with adversity by going through this content, automatically there will be a response. We
Right.
need to stand on our own and create the demand on the strength of our content, not by appealing to baser tendencies, on the fact that this has better ability to generate human potential. That's where we are. And that is why we are doing whatever we are calling in public policy also. It is critical that we offer it that way. Nitividhana is basically about giving a larger repertoire of sense making about Bharat and the world.
Right.
Right? We are not saying public policy as it exists today has to be completely dismantled. Whatever is there, we use economics, we use the social sciences and everything that's there. We use political science as it is, but we'll put a lens, a drishti, that is from a dharmic perspective. And dharma is the complexity science that integrates all of these things together. It has ethics, it has systems, it has complexity understanding, and it also has an ability to look at the larger second, third order consequences. That is the kind of vision that we must provide.
Totally. Thank you for that, Raghavji. Speaking of programs of curriculum building, and like we just spoke of Nitividhana, which is Brhat's flagship program. Um, Here we are, it is, I mean, Nitividhana is anchored in Bharatiya intellectual traditions, Indian knowledge systems, as well as it's engaging in contemporary policy challenges. So, the whole design of this program. Um, what is the whole intention behind it? We've just spoken that it is the need of the hour, but how efficient is bridging these two worlds? Like people want to call it, these are two different worlds: Indian knowledge systems and modern policy frameworks. Bridging is required, and I think that's an effort Nitividhan is making. So, how do you see this as a journey for a learner?
So it's actually public policy is an area because it's multidisciplinary by nature, by definition. It is the best area for Indian knowledge systems to make an intervention because it comes from a holistic kind of perspective, right? And this has been my intuition. And now, we've run 4 editions of this, and we've gotten feedback. So there is also not just our intuition; it is also matched by the voice of people who've gone through this program, the 12-week program, and also the workshops that we do. So in that sense, it gives you a vaster repertoire and not just economics and a little bit of psychology. It also gives you your own cultural constructs to look at this. And this is super critical. If you follow even foreign policy literature in the last few years, and Jaishankarji has been increasingly doing this, if you read his book, Why Bharat Matters and The India Way, in fact, the entire foreign policy is explained through series of anecdotes and references to Ramayana, right, for
Yes.
example. Right? And this is not jingoistic. Like I said, it is unintellectual to say that a civilization that has been existent for about 5,000 years at the very least, depending on where you pick, your historical lesson from, does not have lessons to offer on governance. It's just impossible, right? So therefore, there is a very, very organic case for that. Now, what does Nitividhana do to you? It actually first makes you comfortable in your own skin,
Right.
that you also represent a knowledge tradition, and that knowledge tradition does not require you to dismantle or disown or adopt a schizophrenic approach of being
Hmm.
someone outside and someone inside, right? So firstly, I would say it's at a very human transformation level even before we can look at policy making. And this is actually a quintessential Indian knowledge system approach. We don't look at, when we look at policy also, when you look at any of these macro questions, because of what I mentioned, that the first person subjective experience is critical, we always examine that in the context of the refinement of the person looking at it. Now today, even sort of, all the literature that you see on science also is leading to that point of view, that reality is constructed based on the capacity of the observer. In consciousness studies, they are getting to it, which is the kind of outlook that you get from Vedanta as well. We follow that, and we begin Nitividhana, for example, with an assessment on Swabhava. We
Right.
give you the fundamental vocabulary to understand yourself. What is your Swabhava like? We use Triguna framework, we use Ayurvedic frameworks, we explain Panchamahabhutas. This is fundamental constitution. You
Right.
have senses, you have your ahankara, you have your intelligence, your faculties, and you have your seat of emotions, and you have mind, right? Now, firstly, to understand this, using Ayurvedic and yogic terms, tells you how should you position yourself when you look at any question. And this is a very important thing because unfortunately, a lot of public policy teaching in India is irresponsible, not by design, but by an absence of critical thinking, in real critical thinking. Although they teach critical thinking, they don't apply critical thinking to that thinking itself. And what I mean by that is you are you are actually channeling the moral imagination of the entire young generation And it's not something that has careers, right? It's something that requires struggle, it requires endurance, and it requires young people who are passionate about these larger issues to find the resources within themselves to go through adversity. You are
Right.
taking that moral imagination, putting that into a zone which does not have so many opportunities as it is. It's not like engineering or medical sciences. It is, we all know it's important, but it's not like, it's flush with the ability to absorb 5 crore people at meaningful levels, right? It does not have that capacity. But you are animating them about these causes without giving them the tools to examine their own behavior, or without
Right.
giving them the tools to know themselves first. I would
Hmm.
say it's an epistemic crime. Anything that captures the moral imagination, which is natural, which is so precious, which is the only energy that we have to run the country forward, and which then sort of channels that towards causes without an inner refinement, is leading them. This is what social sciences and humanities, and to a large extent even public policy, has done in India. It has created anger, and nothing productive ever comes out of anger. And this is a vicious loop. You are animated by a cause, and you are not given enough ways to reflect on your own self or refinement of your own interiority. And then you apply that on a social cause. And
Right.
constantly you have this violence within you, which are escalating, that I have something of value to offer that the society is not receiving. Indian knowledge systems flips that question on its head. It
Right.
says that, and this is why you need to study our institutions. That is why you need to study a sampradaya, because adhikara in sampradaya does not come from positing something on the society or imposing something on the society. It comes from the level of chitta shuddhi you are capable of.
Right.
And this level of chitta shuddhi expands your self agency. So what Nitividhana does is it gives our cohorts a way to actually, truly, authentically expand self-agency. So if you have a big concern like education, if you have a big concern like foreign policy, if you have a big concern, whatever your concern is, political science, if you have a bigger concern of nation, if you have the biggest concern of humanity, if you have a largest concern of planet, right? Then you need to do the work within you to understand and how do you prepare for this marathon, infinite game, right? And therefore, your knowledge system has to be something that provides that. So fundamentally, without rejecting all the disciplines that make up public policy today, from economics to political science to public administration to public finance to technology and policy, while we have all of that, we also on top of that have a layer that improves the personal capacity. Because if you want to look at something complex, your capacity needs to increase. You need to become resilient. If your knowledge system or if your pedagogy does not provide that, or if it only does it in one dimension of intellect, does not give you the spiritual, emotional, and social intelligence to deal with Bharat, you will apply your intelligence in the wrong direction. And this
Hmm.
is what we're seeing this is, to me, the problem in public policy education in India today. That you're developing a lot of one dimensional intelligences and deploying them on multi-dimensional challenges.
Right. Right, Raghavji. So, dharma, like niti, these are not abstract ideals. These are actually functioning governance principles that we have in place. And at Niti Vidhan, we explore all of this. And like
Yeah.
you mentioned, we thematically go through the current frameworks, the existing modern Western frameworks also, and we try to understand what we have in store. And then look at everything from a solution based approach, starting from working within ourselves. So that is a very interesting way of finding a solution to what we currently look at in the public policy space as a problem, as a challenge. And I think Nidivadhana is one attempt to rebuild that kind of a grounding. Of course, it
There
won't
there
happen.
needs to be so
Challenges.
much on this, and we are also always humble. It's not the only solution. It's an attempt, right, to at least infuse something that's missing into the pedagogy of this. There needs to be so much of this. We need to go into Arthashastra. We need to the research that we're doing on Niti Shastra. There is no difference for us between Niti and Dharma, and it's so beautifully explained in Shastras, right?
Right.
Niti is the Vyavaharika level, which actually is the application layer of Dharma. They are one and together. They can never be separate. There is no Adhyatma there and Niti here. It's not that. It's
Right.
nested. It's nested, right? You have at the core is Ananda and all the other layers. How does it interact with that? That is the kind of fabric and the kind of fractal nature of Indian knowledge systems itself. Once you see it, you actually start thinking in systems. For us, Indian knowledge systems as a paradigm is the best way to develop complexity thinking and systems thinkers. Systems thinkers in a relational way, not just
Right.
abstract systems, like you said. We actually value the relationships that the society has, using the ways of meaning making that they already have, how they relate to themselves, how they relate to their society, how they relate to nature, how they relate to festivals. None of what the society is experiencing is left out of when we have our own knowledge paradigm. Otherwise, you will have to stand on the top of a hill and demand that somehow the culture sanitizes itself and becomes eligible to accept the gyan that you're giving. This is unfortunately the approach of a lot of liberal public policy think tanks. That's because not that it's malice, not even that in some cases, not even that it's ignorance. It is that there is, of course, a certain kind of cognitive dissonance, and there's a fear of invalidation if you have to go that path, right? Because you have to surrender to that.
True, true that, Raghavji. As much as I love this conversation, I want to keep going on and on. I think today we'll have to conclude, but I want to ask this one question before we call it a day today. It is, how do you think the Bharatiya frameworks do? How do they have the capacity to serve as solutions even for larger global issues? Will these frameworks also work as frameworks that can be applied to different civilizations, different cultures across the world? How do you view this?
Absolutely, yes, because they are grounded, like I said, in the eternal truth of relationship between man with his own self, man with nature, and man with society. These are the eternal philosophical questions. What is the nature of man? What is the nature of our relationship? Right. So all of public policy today, and it's interesting that you know we talk about the challenges that the entire end of history paradigm has given to public policy, right? But in his subsequent work, Identity, he talks about the bigger void, because end of history came at a certain time when it was actually, if you look at it, it's understandable why he said that, because the Cold War era had ended and US was the decisive superpower around that time. He didn't mean that history will conclude. He said that the battle for ideas that will define history has ended. Right. Of course, it didn't take much long for him to be proven wrong, and there's a lot of caricature around that. But to me, the more interesting book is actually the one that followed, Identity, and there he actually goes back to the Greek metaphysics of thymos, of logos, and he talks about and he says there is a void of metaphysics in public policy today. And remember, this is a person who's argued for why nations develop in different ways through the prism of institutions. And there's a very interesting work on this coming from China, Yuan Yuan Hang. And she talks about her in her book, How China Escaped Poverty. We've written reviews on this. She's talking about a new paradigm called adaptive political economy. So you
Hmm.
see two examples, one coming from the Western liberal democracy thinking, which actually went into this arrogance that we've got the final solution for public policy. All we need to do is this magic potion of human rights, free markets, and democracy can be supplanted everywhere, and you will have great results, and therefore it will be the vision of God's kingdom. That didn't transpire, and therefore there is a natural kind of reflection on this coming from the same people who said we've arrived at end of history. And you're also seeing a response from philosophers in China who are saying, hold on, yours is not the only way to build institutions. Or what you
Right.
think institutions is not the only way to conceptualize institutions. We
Hmm.
have a different way. And if you look at it as a surface level, they might appear very different. But if you look at it in our context, if you understand our context, what you mean by institutions in a moral imagination sense for yourself is also what we're doing. And they are saying that the paradigm of adaptive political economy has global power. Adaptive political economy, or in a more interesting book by Michael Muthukrishna, he calls this the culture evolutionary behavioral paradigm of public policy. Now look at the
Yes.
words here, what they're arriving at: culture, evolutionary, behavior. Dharma
Yeah.
is all these three together. And as Kapil Kapoorji says so memorably, is that there has been a one word unwritten constitution in Bharat for over 5,000 years. That word is dharma. It's the compact that builds human relationships with nature, and you cannot argue that that is region specific. Nation states, are subsumed under nature, at least, right? It's not human nature, or nature's nature is not different, even if you are in a different nation state. So while accepting and understanding the world as it is, especially now when exponential technology is weaponizing culture, because now it is about how are you architecting your mind, and how technology is sort of competing with your mind to replicate it, to make decisions for you. This becomes extraordinarily critical, that a culture and civilization that have so much of deep thinking around mind, behavior, and bridge the gap between theory and practice. That is the most important thing. Vedanta might be, a certain idea, but it is the purification through yoga that gives you the ability to accept it and bring it into your experience. So Indian
Yes.
knowledge systems has this complete compact: the theory, the ways to establish the theory, the values embedded into that, and the ritual praxis, which will give you access to all of this. And this compact is essential for the entire world. That is why I said it's not just an India endeavor, it's an endeavor to have a voice, a sane, mature, adult civilizational voice in the era of tantrums by global leaders and adolescent outrages that we're seeing. It is important that a mature civilization which has knowledge about human behavior brings that knowledge to the seat, that where global policy is being discussed.
Absolutely. That I think was a very good way of putting it. Mature civilization and also adolescent stages and also immature. So
This is wisdom tradition, right? We just have to look at it as wisdom traditions.
right, right, sir. Right. So I think we can agree that culture compatibility is not no longer an option. In fact, for anybody, not just for India, and it's essentially for all of us to become more efficient, to recognize, to contextualize, and to behave in a manner what the need of the hour is. Also recognizing what the ancestors have given us as frameworks, and keeping it in context, putting into use, and living more meaningfully.
That's
Right,
what
Sarah?
public policy should do, ideally. So thank you so much. I'm so
Thank you
glad
so
that
much.
young people like you who are interested in public policy, who reflect deeply on this, are open enough to look at our own culture, not from a borrowed narrative, but through the effort required to earn that opinion. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Raghavji, for joining the both conversation today. And in fact, in this series, we'll be having many more conversations around policy, on how we view policy, on different aspects. We'll be exploring different frameworks, also aspects from Panchatantra on governance, on how storytelling has a way of teaching governance, and many more interesting aspects like that. And thank you so much for everybody who's listening in, and stay tuned for many more such exploratory conversations around public policy, around Indian knowledge systems and governance. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Cherish.